Alright, this morning we're going to discuss the problem that faces most developers, at least at one point in their career, and that is what happens when you execute a query which is fast in Management Studio, but it's slow in the application. And today is part one. There's going to be several parts to this. The rest of the parts, the remaining parts of this, will be private, so it'll be subscriber content only, but today we're going to discuss the very first initial part of that, which is, so we run a query and it's super fast in Management Studio, but when we run it in the application, it's slow. And when I say application, keep in mind I could be talking about a .NET application, could be talking about a Ruby application, could be talking about anything. With this type of troubleshooting, I've seen anything from, let's see, what is it, SSRS to any type of .NET application. So let's start with one of our stored procedures here, and it is the get name. And what it does is it's going to look at this salespeople table, and it's going to get a name, and we're going to pass in the parameter of let's see, in, which stands for names. We're selecting the name where the name equals in, so whatever in is passed into. So I'm going to keep this window open here, and we're going to alter this in a second. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to execute that stored procedure in this window. And we're going to get the name Sarah. Now I happen to know that there are fewer Sarahs in the table than there are Johns, because actually Sarah is a very common name, but John is an even more common name. And before I do that, what I want to do is I want to set the XML statistics on, or statistics XML, and I'm going to execute this query. And what it'll do, and again it's going to be super fast because we're in Management Studio, is it's going to produce that we have one Sarah in the table, and then it's going to have this beautiful XML plan here. So now that that's turned on, and we will open this up. Now, if you're familiar with XML, if you're not, you can go Google it, get some information, but this is kind of how, when you load up XML, this is kind of how it's going to look. What we're going to do is we're going to scroll down, and we're going to find where we get to the parameter list, because in our stored procedure we have the parameter. If we look at this stored procedure, we have a parameter called in, right? And this parameter is being used in this where clause. And so just like what we're doing kind of is discussing indexing before, we're getting into indexing by showing you kind of how parameters are used in stored procedures and slowly moving in that direction. Right now what we have to understand is that in this parameter list, we're looking at the column reference column in, and we have the parameter compiled value equals Sarah, and the parameter runtime value equals Sarah. Now, that's actually not a problem because we are looking for Sarah in the table. Okay? Suppose that we were looking for John. And I'm going to go ahead and close this. And we execute. And let's open this up. Okay, we have a lot of Johns in that table. And you'll notice that going back to our parameter list, it's looking at this parameter in. The compiled value is Sarah, but the parameter runtime value is John. Okay, so again, let's just think about this logically. When we look at this stored procedure, at the time that this query is executed, it does not actually know what in is, right? So if we look at that, the compiled value is Sarah, and the runtime value is John. Okay, so one of the solutions that you'll see, and if you were to Google this error, you'll see this solution, and I'll kind of tell you why it's the solution, or one of the possible solutions, not always, is that you will localize a parameter. You will localize your variable, if you would, and we'll set in im equal to in. And then we're going to say where the name equals nm. Now again, we'll notice that there's a compiled value here. Okay, that's because this is the compiled value of that stored procedure currently is holding Sarah. and you can recompile the stored procedure. But if parameter sniffing is the problem in your um, situation, and it not always is, but if it is the problem in your situation, recompiling it, if there's going to be different parameters from time to time being called, it's not really going to be your solution there. And again, I want to be very careful, because parameter sniffing is not necessarily a bad thing. Anytime people say it's a bad thing, I'm like, well, actually it's not. For instance, I have a stock table, and I happen to know that the majority of clients, 99% of them, are looking at the S&P 500. That means that it should use the assumption that it's probably going to be the S&P 500, because only 1% of the cases are going to be something different, and it doesn't affect the overall performance. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and we're going to rebuild the stored procedure, and again we're declaring a localized variable. Again, let's look at this just to see. We have the column reference, compile value Sarah, runtime value John. Now we're going to run it with John, and we're going to bring up a new execution plan in XML, and we're going to scroll down to our parameters again, parameter list, and we're going to notice that there's no compiled value. There's just a runtime value. And we'll also notice that it's changed to NM, obviously, because that's what the query is using, is NM. Keep in mind that when the stored procedure, so this is coming from an outside source, this is coming from, I always like to think of it as a local source, right? And to use a very, very bad and incomplete analogy, but something that might help new people understand better, would you trust a total outsider providing you with financial advice, or would you trust someone that you know with financial advice? Well, in this type of query situation, this is very similar. This is a local parameter for this query. So think of this as being you're receiving information from someone you know and that you trust already, versus you're receiving information from someone that you are very unaware of. And that's like I said, a very, very kind of bad, incomplete analogy, but it's something to make you think. The difference between these two is you have a compiled value, and your runtime value is John, and in this one you have a runtime value being John. So yes, you can recompile the stored procedure, nothing wrong with that. But in a case where there could be all kinds of different parameters being passed in, that's not going to be the best solution. The most appropriate thing would be to localize your variables. You can also optimize your query with basically unknown, so that optimize for unknown, so that it doesn't make any assumption. This is usually, not always, this I have seen is usually, I'd say about 60% of the time when we have an issue where it's fast in Management Studio and slow in the application, this is usually the culprit. And so that kind of gives you a brief summary of that. We'll continue going into this series. There's a few other items that it also could be not quite as common, but it's good to familiarize yourself with this information so that you understand the mechanics of your stored procedures and parameters.